ரொம்ப ரொம்ப நல்ல খুব ভালো
So, last time, Nivedita, we were discussing my oncoming trip to the United States. As you recollect, Carl Wono, the army chief, was very keen that I should visit them.
right, right.
And in the event, government of India requested me to go, so I said, fine. Now, before I went there, I had a number of, what shall I call it, messages from the British Army chief in UK. He was a general, I'll just give you his name, John Chappell. John Chappell was a general, he was the army chief. He later became a field marshal and became the chief of defense staff in UK. And he had been a brigadier commanding the Hong Kong Gurkha Brigade under the British. You know, the Gurkha regiments, after partition, were divided between Britain and India. They got some 4 or 5 regiments, and we got the rest. And they only have 2 left now. But when he had about 3 battalions of Gurkhas or 2 battalions in Hong Kong, he was the brigade commander. And he was very keen on photography of wild animals. In other words, shooting a wild animal with a camera. So he had visited Nepal on a number of occasions. And when he visited Nepal, he goes through the Terai region of Nepal, which is contiguous to Jim Corbett Park. So messages were coming from him to me that, why don't you invite me to India? I want to go to the Jim Corbett Park and shoot tigers with my camera. Since he was a Gurkha officer, he was very keen on extending his visits, not only the Terai region of Nepal, but also to the forests of India. So many people came to me, including Brigadier Sukhjit Singh. Now, Brigadier Sukhjit Singh retired, is the Maharaja of Kapurthala. We knew each other from 1965 war, when he was a major and so was I. And a very close friend and a very charming gentleman. He came and visited my office and asked me, why aren't you inviting the British Army chief to come to India? So I said, I am not averse to his coming to India. In fact, I'd welcome him. But somehow, whenever I put this up to the Ministry of External Affairs, they turn it down one way or another. I had rung up the then Foreign Secretary, Mr. S.K. Singh. I said, now what's the problem? Why don't you allow the invitation to the British Army chief? So he said, we don't want to write this down. This I've not been replying your letters from your MI directorate. But we're angry with the British. Apparently, we had bought some equipment from Britain. One was the Jaguar aircraft, it's a fighter aircraft. And another was a combat engineer tractor, CET. A combat engineer tractor is like a tank, but like a bulldozer. It's got a dozer blade and it's got a grappling thing. So it is used in the field, in the face of the enemy, if you like, to clear mines and to recover tanks and other vehicles which have got stuck. So it's like an ordinary bulldozer, but it is armored. So we had bought these 2 pieces of equipment, and apparently the British cheated us, as they always do, as you know. So we had paid for the new equipment, both for the Jaguar as well as for the combat engineer tractor, brand new. He said, we'll start a new production line. But in the event, they sent the new production to their own units, and they took tractors and, for that matter, these aircraft from existing units where they were in use, overhauled them, said they were new, charged the full new price, and then sent that. Which resulted in a lot of problems in the air. They wouldn't move, and they didn't have spares, and they didn't have so many things, so we were very angry with them. So I told the Foreign Secretary that, as far as I know, the British Army chief is not involved in anything of this sort. Britain has a separate organization called Royal Ordnance. It's the Royal Ordnance led by another 4-star general and also some civilians, who do the export and so on from Britain. So I said, there is no problem as far as the British military chief is concerned. Nevertheless, there was a problem. So anyway, with that background, I meanwhile left for America. So Srupi and I decided to go the wrong way. You know, the correct way to go to America is by flying through Europe and reaching Washington or whatever it is. But there was a big exercise on in America, which I wanted to attend. It's the tank and infantry plus aircraft exercise, and I wanted to see this exercise. This was being held at the Colorado Desert on the western side of the states. So I thought it may be better to go from the western side of the US. That means you fly to Hong Kong. From Hong Kong, you take a flight via Tokyo to Los Angeles or San Francisco, and then you attend this exercise, which is near Los Angeles. But having experienced this, I must say that this is the wrong way to go because you get a lot of jet lag. You cross the international date line when you're moving across the Pacific from west to east, and you lose a whole day of sleep. See? So you are absolutely jet lagged by the time you reach the Hawaii Islands and the American station at Honolulu. Anyway, we went this way and we landed up in Honolulu, and they knew that we'd be fully jet lagged. So they had an admiral in charge of the Western U.S. command. He's a 5-star officer, and under him, 4-star or 5-star, and under him he had 3-star commanders for Army, Navy, Air Force. And so the 3-star Army commander there, General Kicklighter, was our host. And he told me as soon as we arrived, he says, you took the wrong way and you're going to be very jet lagged, so we'll allow you a full day and night to just sleep. So we did that. Anyway, after that, we attended some of their exercises in Honolulu. And I had with me a Lieutenant General Ajay Singh. I'm sorry to tell you that he passed away last night at the age of 88. Lieutenant General Ajay Singh was the head of my Armored Corps, the Director General Armored Corps. And I had him accompany me along with one of my staff officers. And we saw this exercise. And then General Kicklighter invited us to dinner. And Ajay Singh was very upfront, getting angry with Kicklighter for not having shown us a correct exercise, a correct training of troops. In fact, he was angry that we're not training American troops correctly. You have had a divisional exercise out in the open with tentage and all that, and enemy artillery will fire at you and you will not be finished. He says, you must learn from India that we have to dig down. That means if you go to division headquarters in the field, within the range of enemy artillery, you must dig down 10, 12 feet into the earth, cover it with sandbags and so on, so that you are secure from enemy artillery fire. Of course, Kicklighter did tell him that his task is amongst the Pacific Rim nations. Pacific Rim nations means not China, but the Southeast Asian countries and their islands and so on, none of whom have artillery. So I kept watching this because it's quite amusing. I allowed these two lieutenant generals to have it out. Ajay Singh's point was very clear. He said, no matter whether they have artillery or not, you never know when they do get artillery or 3-inch mortars or 4.5-inch mortars. And unless you train your troops to dig down properly immediately, you're going to come a serious casualty in any conflict that you do, even if it is on the Pacific Rim. So I'm sure Kicklighter learned a lot of lessons from our team. Anyway, we spent a few days there, saw some of the local people with the Maori population, and their culture. They meet you by rubbing noses, if you please. And of course, the noses are a bit sweaty and all that, but nonetheless, you have to do that. And it's quite amusing. They go shinning up these coconut trees, just like they do in South India, in Kerala, and for that matter, in Colombo and in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, shinning up the tree with no other purpose except for bare feet in your hand and just go like a monkey up the tree. Will they show us that? And many of them were in the American Army, but they dressed like the local people when they're showing us these stunts. So that was a good couple of days visit to Hawaii. After that, we were supposed to go to to San Francisco. But at that time, 1989, I think it was early October, there was a huge earthquake in San Francisco. Now, a number of Indian friends, including one of my regimental officers who's retired as a brigadier and commanded 16 Cavalry during 65 war, he's located in California, and so he had invited Rupi and me to dinner and so on. But in the event, the Americans suggested that we don't land at California because an earthquake had taken place. Large number of roads have been upheaval amongst the roads, and there's a fair amount of casualties, and a lot of relief operations were ongoing. No time for a foreign chief to visit that area. So instead of spending a night in San Francisco and say a night or maybe 2 nights because of exercise at Los Angeles, I spent all 3 nights in Los Angeles. Los Angeles, we arrived there, and I had a number of other friends to visit whom I knew from before. I visited them on the coastline of the Pacific, very fine houses, etc. And then went to the Colorado desert by helicopter to see this exercise. Now, for this exercises, I wanted to see how their tanks were functioning. They had the Abrams tank, which is supposed to be a very expensive but very high quality tank. And the American chief and his local corps commander who's running the exercise were very keen that I should like the Abrams tank so that we would recommend Indian government to buy this tank for India. But we knew the qualities of this Abrams tank, and we had already decided not to buy it. Nonetheless, I attended this exercise and enjoyed quality time with some of the tank crews. There were blacks and whites all mixed up, everyone wearing hearing aids, if you please, because the American Army has orders that every soldier wears earplugs every time they go for tank firing or any firing, or every time they get into a helicopter. Part of their uniform is for earplugs, made of some jelly sort of stuff, or otherwise to put into your ears to stop you getting deaf. And a large number of American troops were wearing hearing aids supplied by the government because they lose hearing during their duties. I tried to pass that on to the Indian medical people when I came back from America, but I'm sorry to say today we don't do that even now. To put earplugs for any type of firing, because the ears are very sensitive, and with these loud noises, they do lose a fair amount of hearing. I attended this exercise, and yes, we enjoyed the exercise. It was quite good. The gun of the Abrams tank is very highly technically superior, shall I call it. There are all sorts of computer systems and all that, flashing lights to help you get a correct aim so that you hit the first round on the target. But I noticed that one of the sergeants, who was a black sergeant, he was firing quite accurately. I said, aren't you using all these lights that are happening? He said, no, that's for the people to buy them. And it's very interesting to see how these lights function here. We don't bother. We just put the aiming mark on the target and let it. If not the first round, certainly the second round is going to hit. So that's exactly how the tank crews function. Much of the cost of a tank, by the way, Navigator, is the electronics. I would say almost 40% or 45% of the cost of a tank, which may go into 15 crores if you like, is the electronic systems. So people do spend a lot of money buying this, but in the actual field, I'm not very certain that it's very useful because in the field of battle, there's a lot of tension when the enemy is firing at you, and you've got very large guns. When you swing the turret, it's observed, and a lot of heavy metal comes flying at you. So you've got to be very sharp on your firing, and you can't waste time waiting for electronics to function. You have to shoot fast and accurately. And if a gunner is well trained, he certainly gets, if not the first, the second round is always on the top. So we attended this exercise. And when I went to America, I not only took my military assistant, that's Brigadier B M Kapoor, who later retired from my regiment. later retired as a Lieutenant General, as a corps commander. But with me, he was a brigadier, and he was a great help because he'd been to America before on a course. And also I took Tim Hunt, who was the local military advisor to the American embassy here in Delhi. And he was a Lieutenant Colonel Tim Hunt. I took him along because he's an American. He knew how to speak Hindi. I've told you about him before. When Carl Bono had visited India, that's the American chief. And he was advising us also and introducing us to the local military officials. From here, we went to one corps in Texas. One corps is mostly a corps for foreign engagements. It is the one that went into Iraq, for example, in 2003 when they attacked Iraq. Now, one corps is mostly based on helicopters and other troops and infantry and tanks, etc., lighter nature, which can be flown anywhere in the world. It's an intervention force. It's an interesting point because if you recollect, I told you about our Maldives operation and we managed it due to very good luck. We managed it very effectively, though we didn't have a special force at that time. So America has this force. It's a whole corps commanded by a Lieutenant General. I spent 2 days with them. Very, very hardworking people. Morning to night, they're busy. They have not got much time for social business at night. They're staying with their families in Texas, Fort Hood. But they're very busy day and night. Only their Saturdays and Sundays maybe are free. Very hardworking people, I noticed. But, you know, hard work is an interesting point. You don't want to tire yourself out during peacetime so that you're tired if you go to war. You have to train for war, but you must have periods of relaxation where you can ease off and be with your families, etc. Anyway, every country has their own methods of functioning. Intervention in other countries, I've spoken about this earlier. I'm not very fond of intervening in other people's countries, but America does consider itself as the policeman of the world. So intervention in other people's affairs is part of their lexicon. And they do that, they stay for some time and then they run away. I told you when I was discussing the cancellation of the withdrawal operation of war from India, because Britain and America being surrounded by the seas, they fight in other people's countries, but they run away from there in case things get too hot, like they did from Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan lately, and so on. I found American troops, their men and their ladies, very similar to anywhere in the world. They all have the little problems. In fact, I think all military people all over the world, no matter which country they belong to, have similar problems. Problems of separation of the husband from the family for a number of period of time, the problems of schooling, the problems of pay and perks not being very much. Whenever there's a conflict, yes, pay and perks come up, but when the conflict is over, military people tend to be forgotten and chastised for that matter for government spending too much money on them. But if there's a problem of war or conflict, then of course they come into their own and are much loved by everybody. It's an interesting situation. All over the world is very similar. And the problems of their families and their children is very similar. They're posted from place to place. So they keep moving from place to place. Their children are educated in various places. With the result, they do get a cosmopolitan view, like they do in India, rather than getting stuck to one town or one state for the whole of your life. After this exercise, I arrived in Washington, and I had a few days there with the chief to discuss various aspects, which we did. And he was very keen that I should do two things. One, that I should visit Fort Leavenworth. Fort Leavenworth is like a higher command course, and you know, Army War College in what used to be called the College of Combat in Mao, and an infantry training school where you train officers from younger groups to very senior groups, similar to that. And since General Carl Bono had already commanded Fort Leavenworth before he became the chief, he was very keen that I should go there with my wife, see their training, and give him any comments that I had. So I did that. I went to Fort Leavenworth. There was a lieutenant general commanding Fort Leavenworth, and they were running an exercise for the American troops in Europe. Now, Europe, they had about 2 or 3 corps of infantry and the NATO forces. And to exercise these gentlemen, in my time, I'm talking of 1989, early October, they were running a war game on computers. They were acting as the enemy, the Russian troops, and they were acting, giving computer orders to the corps, and the corps commanders are being exercised to how they deploy their troops and how do they function on a computer, how do they move their troops depending on the Russians attacking them here and there, attacking Germany. So I watched this exercise going, then I wanted to go and see who were acting as the enemy. So I was led to a separate building where there was a brigadier in charge of a number of computers and a number of officers and men who were running all these computers in control of the troops in Europe. And I asked the brigadier, I said, have you commanded a division? He said, no, not yet. Commanded a brigade of infantry, but not a division. I said, yet you're acting as the Russian commander-in-chief, commanding about 30 or 40 divisions. I said, maybe your experience of commanding a division is lacking because you haven't done that. So how do you function as the enemy? I mean, how do you know what the enemy is going to do? He said, oh, well, we've studied all their publications. We've studied all their drills, and we have practiced them, and we know exactly what they're going to do. So I told him, in war, very few generals follow the laid down drills or the laid down methods of tactical functioning or strategic functioning. Because a senior commander has a single aim of destroying his enemy or beating his rival on the opposite side. And he would normally, to achieve surprise, never follow the published drills or techniques of fighting. A good general will go beyond that and do something different to surprise the enemy. So I said, since you are following a well-known procedure, your corps commanders in Europe know what the enemy is likely to do, and hence they're not being exercised well. So I told his commander, who was the Lieutenant General, Major General of Lieutenant General commanding Fort Leavenworth, I said, no, this is not the way of doing it. He said, how do you do it in India? I said, in India, we don't, if you're exercising troops to fight the Chinese or to fight the Pakistanis, we don't pretend to be Pakistanis or Chinese. We make Indians fight against India. And I quoted Thucydides, the famous general of the Polynesian Wars in ancient Greece, who has written a book on the art of war. He was a major general. He had commanded a division in the field when Athens was fighting against Sparta. And he wrote this philosophy that only when Greek fights Greek, then is the clash of war. You can't pretend to be something else. You are what you are. So if you want an enemy, you must produce that enemy from within yourself and fight against the people being exercised who are also part of the same country. So if you have the same brains and capability. So I said, similarly, you can't pretend to be a Russian because you're not a Russian. And therefore, secondly, or the Soviet Union at that time. So following their drills and procedures, just rest assured they never follow drills and procedures. A good general never does that. And if you recollect, Soviet Union has defeated Hitler and his armies during World War II. And when the Napoleonic Wars took place in 1812, the then Russia, General Kutuzov, if I'm not mistaken, defeated Napoleon. Not by actually defeating him, but by withdrawing appropriately till the French armies were stretched very far into Russia, right up to Moscow. But the Russians, as they withdrew, burnt everything. They burnt villages, they burnt the house, they burnt Moscow, they burnt the reserves, they destroyed the water thing, so that the French army had no means of survival. And winter caught them, and it is General Winter who destroyed the Grand French army in 1812. So when I came back, I told that to Karl von. I don't know if they learned that lesson. I suppose they have. Now, in second point that Karl von wanted me to do was to visit their think tank. Now, the think tank is something like our National Security Advisory Board. It comprises some about 25 people from all walks of life, top members of the three services, top members of the intelligence people, a few representatives, top members of the few of the bureaucracy, newspapers, business leaders. You have this group of people who reach the top of the line to discuss various problems that may arise in the future and write papers for the government to say that in the future something like this might happen. The idea behind this is that, governments are busy doing day-to-day affairs because to run a country requires full-time effort of the president or the prime minister and his cabinet. And though they do have thoughts about the future, but what's going to happen 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, maybe they don't give that much consideration. It's a very busy life for them. So you have this group of wise men who write papers on what might happen 5 years hence or 10 years hence. What is the aim of the country? How do we get on there? And most countries have an organization like this. So I visited this group and they started briefing me. They said, before we explain to you what we do, we'll give you a briefing on the present situation in the world. They started from Japan and China, Soviet Union, Europe, South Asia, India, Africa, like that, England, all around the world to show what their intelligence and where these people are going. And that would be the reason how the American government and the military forces, their intelligence forces, would function to ensure progress of their strategic agenda, whatever it is. So I didn't think much of this briefing, so I stood up in the middle of the briefing. I said, I'm sorry, I don't quite agree with what you are saying, because you said this about Japan, you said this about China, I don't agree with it. So the chairman told me, or General, you tell us. So I got up, I told them what I thought of what's happening in the world and what's likely to happen in the next few years, in my view. Then one of them asked me, are you a PhD in international relations? I said, no, I'm an uneducated soldier of the Indian Army. But I'm watching all you. We are in South Asia. We are looking very carefully at everybody. And we've got our views, what you're doing and where you're going. So these are my views. I didn't think much of this group. I think, if I might say, I think they're very arrogant. So one of them told me that, General, we thought of all these things. It is going to be Pax Americana. That means rulership of the United States forever and ever in this world. So I said, I think, according to our philosophy, that's not possible. Everything gets born, it grows, and it dies. The same is going to happen to you. It happens to all kingdoms. It happened to the Roman Empire, which lasted for almost 7 or 8 centuries and eventually expired. So they said, no, we've studied all these reasons as to why the Roman Empire collapsed, and we are making sure that that doesn't happen in America. So I said, look, I don't agree with you, because what really destroyed the Roman Empire is the fact that they were so super confident about themselves. And since they were ruling the known world at that time, they came to wine, women, and song in their top leadership and their top military commanders. They were not practiced so well in war. So this chap from Carthage, which would now the present-day Tunisia area, Hannibal, led his forces through Spain through southern France with elephants, crossed the Alps, and debouched on the plains of the Valley of the Po in northern Italy. And when the Roman legions were sent to him, he destroyed them in the famous Battle of Cannae. I said that happened because of the super self-confidence and arrogance of the Roman legions. I said, I think you guys are going the same way. My advice is cut that out and assess things more from the point of view of other people rather than your own. I don't know if they got anywhere, but that's my view. I don't think it's correct for any set of people to think they're going to rule the world forever. In fact, I told them, just because you won the World War II and also you acquired the nuclear weapon capability and you can destroy anyone you like, it doesn't mean that you're going to rule the world forever because we don't accept your rule. If you don't accept your rule, then you can't rule it. Anyway, matter for consideration for every country. I think one has to be a little more humble, if I might use that word, and not be arrogant. See, once you get arrogant, the thinking mechanism is not adequate. So I came back to Washington and told Carl Bono all this. I said, look, you commanded this place, but I'm afraid, firstly, it must be American fighting American in your training exercises so that then is the clash of. And secondly, don't be too arrogant. Be very careful in your assessment of others and don't try and run the whole world yourself. It's not going to be possible. Whether they've taken that advice or not, I don't know. You can see the news today. All of us are retired, including Carl Bono. So every few years, top leadership changes. And you can see what's happening in the world with the Ukraine war and other things as to where we are going. And where is the future of that, we wait and see. Anyway, I wanted to go and visit the Niagara Falls once 4 or 5 days with Washington is over. And I told Carl Bono that I'd like to see the Niagara Falls. So I was given an aircraft, and over a Saturday and Sunday, we went to Buffalo rather. And we had a brigadier from the National Guard hosting us, who explained to us the geography of the Niagara Falls and the river between Canada and US. And he explained that very well. The National Guard is like our territorial army. Very fine brigadier, I liked it. He was a doctor, actually, a physician. And there were 3 friends who were running a clinic. One was a surgeon, one was a pathologist, and one was a medical specialist. This guy was the medical specialist. And they were running a simple clinic, the 3 of them making a lot of money. But to allow a little interest and excitement in their lives, they joined the National Guard. So they were all brigadiers in the National Guard. They used to take leave turn by turn and then go either hiking in the Himalayas or investigating darkest Africa or something, or going skiing, going whitewater rafting or something adventurously. So I liked the brigadier. He explained things to us, and Srupi and I flew in a helicopter to the Canadian side over the Niagara Falls. Then on the Canadian side, there was a restaurant. It was Halloween. We were hosted and toasted by the Canadian Mounted Police and very well looked after. All the servers in that restaurant, because of Halloween, were dressed up in all sorts of funny costumes. And I looked at the geography of that place and the gorge that is created by the St. Lawrence River after crossing the Niagara Falls. I said, this is a very good defensive position. And the chap from the Canadian Mounted Police, who was our host, he said, well, General, there's a quiet border between Canada and the United States, but we'd like to tell you that the United States has never been able to attack and capture anything in Canada since history. And that's a fact. They did try, but British armies also used to be, because Canada was a part of the British Commonwealth. So British armies used to be there to defend Canada. So Canada has never lost any territory military to America. Now, meanwhile, on Broadway, now I must tell you, in New York, there is the Broadway, which is excellent stage shows. The only others which are, I think, comparable is the London stage. So you have a whole lot of plays going on all the time. So there was a play going on called The Phantom of the Opera. You may have heard of it. The Phantom of the Opera was going on for God knows, about 25, 30 years in Broadway, and for about 40 years in London. Surupi and I were very keen to see this. It's about a 2.5 hours play. And we tried to get seats in New York, but there were none available for the next 10 years. So I rang up my MA, my military attaché in London, who had been a colleague of mine. And he was a brigadier there from the Gurkhas. I said, check up with the British Army chief, who's also a Gurkha, in your language, if he can get us some seats on the London stage for seeing opera, the Phantom of the Opera, because I was going to fly from New York to India via London, to change planes in London. I was flying Air India. I was spending 2 nights in London. So I got a message back, yes, the British chief will arrange something, provided you stop and have dinner with him or lunch. I said, fine, we'll do that. So when we arrived in London, we went to lunch with the British Army chief, that's John Chappell, and his wife was a very charming lady. She was a diving champion in her own day, water diving, swimming pool. And while we were having drinks, he says, the general, I'd like you to see my study. So we went to his study. He said, now, for instance, you're on 2 regiments, you belong to 16 Light Cavalry and you belong to 66 Armor Regiment. And he had this cabinet of drawers. He opened a drawer of 16 Light Cavalry and the full history of my regiment was there. Very interesting. So he's one of those chaps who's collector of information. He said, I have information on every single unit of the Indian Army and the British Army, your badges of rank, your history, when you were raised, what happened to you. So since I'm so fond of India, why are you not inviting me to India when I'm wanting to go shoot a tiger with my camera? So I said, John, trouble is that you British have taught India to be controlled by a thing called the bureaucracy. You yourself have changed, but the bureaucracy in India is very difficult to get past. They somehow don't like you, especially with they think you did them down by the sale of the Jaguar and combat engineer tractor, and they don't want to invite you in the foreign ministry. It's not my fault. I put up the case. And you have a lot of friends in India, including Sukhjit, the Maharaja of Kapurthala, and they've all come to me. So I'd love to have you there, but unless I get sanction from the government through the foreign ministry, I can't invite you. He said, what am I supposed to do? I said, you approach your ambassador in India. He should talk to our foreign minister, and they should give orders to the foreign secretary to allow us to invite you. And that's how it worked, just like it did with Karl Bauer. So that was the invitation to John Chappell. It happened after he proved that he knows more about the Indian Army than all of us. Then we went and saw this Phantom of the Opera, and we flew back to India. That was my trip to the United States. It's a very interesting trip. There's one thing in the United States trip which I must tell you. While on the Karl wanted to invite me to drinks and dinner at his home, and we met his wife, and Surupi had given a very nice present made by Nandita, a sheer black chiffon dress with all sorts of stuff on it, and perfect fit. And the lady looked much more beautiful after she wore it straight away for the party, and she looked very nice. And he also gave us some present. Then I told him that, I think the Soviet Union is collapsing, because a few months earlier I'd been in the Soviet Union. So he called for Scotch. He was drinking beer, I was drinking Scotch whiskey. He said, I'll have a Scotch whiskey with you to say cheers to the victory of the United States. So I said, what do you mean victory? What victory? He said, the victory of the Cold War. The Soviet Union is collapsing, as you say, then we won. I said, no, you haven't won. You've got a huge